Welcome to Tokyo Wave, recorded in a live studio in Harajuku, Japan, with your hosts Aaron and Parker. All right, everyone, welcome to episode 25 of Tokyo Wave. We're your hosts Aaron Randall
and Parker Allen. Today we are joined by a special guest, Asian public policy expert, political science professor, and politics commentator, Dr. Steven Nagy.
On Tokyo Wave, we bring you weekly updates from our studio in Harajuku.
Join us in segments featuring this week's top news,
political happenings,
business,
and other random stuff. Here are this week's top news highlights.
Defense Minister Taro Kono says Japan could face snap election in October.
Seibu Railway Company to spray antiviral coating material inside all of its 1,288 train carriages.
Whoa. Mauritius Premier says Japan government not responsible for oil spill.
This week in Japan.
Defense Minister Taro Kono says Japan could face a snap election in October.
Kyodo News reported that on September 9th, Defense Minister Taro Kono said at a conference that he is expecting a snap general election, possibly in October, after a successor to outgoing Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is selected next week.
Kono said during an online event with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, "We expect an early general election, possibly sometime in October."
Kono also said that Japan will be ready for next year's Tokyo 2020 Olympics and Paralympics, which were postponed to next summer due to the pandemic.
Ready or not, here they come. Kono's comment comes amid much speculation that the new prime minister may quickly call a lower house election to capitalize on a possible popularity boost that tends to follow a change in leadership. A general election must be held by late October of next year, when the current four-year term for the lower house ends.
Kono also said, "I think there's going to be a very small window for a general election. So the new prime minister will probably grab that window, and you will have a new prime minister elected by the people before you elect the president of the United States."
Next up, Seibu Railway Company to spray antiviral coating material inside all of its 1,288 train carriages.
Wow. The Mainichi reported that Seibu Railway Company in eastern Japan has been taking preventative measures against the spread of the coronavirus by using antiviral, antibacterial coating material on the handles, doors, and other surfaces inside all of its 1,288 carriages.
Wouldn't want that job. The work, which uses spray cans of a coating agent that neutralizes the infectiousness of viruses or bacteria, has been conducted since late August at 6 rail yards. It will be finished by the end of October, with stickers being attached to train cars where the coating has been completed. Stickers!
I think people are going to avoid setting in or being in those areas possibly.
Well, I guess we can get on the Seibu train from November, right?
Yeah.
It's safe. Squeaky clean.
So pairs of cleaning workers sent by contractors were seen working on each car at the Minami Iriso railcar base at the city of Sayama Saitama Prefecture north of Tokyo. 1.5 spray cans are used per car on the handrails, handles, and doors, among other surfaces that have a high chance of being touched by passengers.
Well, you know, in America, we usually use our spray cans on the outside of the train carriages. A chemical agent, including the coating material, will be used in disinfection measures in order to maintain its effectiveness. Next up, Mauritius Premier says Japan government not responsible for oil spill.
Kyodo reported that Mauritian Prime Minister Pravind Jugnauth said September 7th he is thankful for the Japanese government's assistance over a major oil spill despite it not being responsible for the accident.
Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi spoke by phone with the Mauritian Prime Minister for the first time since the oil leakage from a Japanese freighter in July.
Jugnauth asked Japan for continued support to restore the Indian Ocean island nation's economy and nature following the spill.
Telling the Mauritian Prime Minister Japan takes a serious view of this accident, Motegi said he promised to provide long-term assistance to Mauritius, including steps to enhance safety at sea and revitalize local fishery communities.
A Mauritian government document has shown it is proposing that Japan pay a total of 1.34 billion Mauritian rupees, equivalent to around 3.6 billion yen or 34 million US dollars. This is to assist the local fishing community affected by the spill.
Motegi said that a specific amount of Japanese aid to Mauritius was not discussed in the telephone talks.
Separately, Mauritius is set to seek compensation over the spill from the freighter's Japanese owner, Nagashiki Shipping Company, and has called for the submission of claims by those who have sustained losses or damage due to the contamination.
The Panamanian-flagged bulk carrier Wakashio, operated by Mitsui OSK Lines, ran aground on July the 25th, spilling more than 1,000 tons of oil into Mauritius's pristine environment.
Mauritius declared a state of environmental emergency on August 7th, citing fears about the impact on endangered species such as the birds and sea turtles. Fishing off coastal areas impacted by the spill is currently banned.
So far, Japan has sent 3 disaster relief teams to help with oil removal and assess environmental damage, including in mangroves. You know, we talked about this earlier on an earlier episode.
Mm-hmm.
And what is it? They sent like 6 people?
Yeah. I'm wondering how many people are on each of those teams. Maybe just a couple or...
Who knows? Maybe they had to socially distance, so they can only put 6 people on a plane. You know? But, you know, Mauritius is a small country, and it's not a rich country. And it's also a country that deeply is dependent on tourism to sustain its local economy. So this oil spill was really a black eye for the country and also for the Japanese government, because obviously it's not like Prime Minister Abe dropped that oil in the ocean, but, you know, it's a Japanese company, so of course Japan's going to get stuck with the bill, which it looks like it will end up paying in an act of checkbook diplomacy.
I can already see the meme of Abe pouring the oil. If someone hasn't made that yet.
Are they going to wrap those billions in a beautiful furoshiki?
You're now listening to Tokyo Wave.
Well, speaking of political happenings, our special guest this week is Dr. Steven Nagy, Asian public policy expert, political science professor, and politics commentator.
Originally from Calgary, Canada, Dr. Steven Nagy provides macro-level geopolitical analysis on trends in the region to businesses, governments, and the media.
He has published widely in peer-reviewed international journals such as China Perspectives, East Asia, the Journal of Asian Politics and History, and the International Studies Review on topics related to trade, nationalism, and China-Japan relations.
He has also published to think tank and commercial outlets such as the China Economic Quarterly and the World Commerce Review on trade and political risk.
Steven is a frequent commentator on political, economic, and security issues in East Asian politics and international relations in Japanese and international media outlets such as the New York Times, South China Morning Post, the Japan Times, the National Post, CNBC, Al Jazeera, Channel News Asia, and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation.
Steven is a senior associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies at International Christian University. He obtained his PhD in International Relations from Waseda University.
So, Steven, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for the very long introduction and somewhat embarrassing introduction. But, it's great to be here with you guys. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, let's get started. So, first of all, we are not just an IR podcast. Of course, we talk about Japanese current issues and say the F word a lot, which gets bleeped out. But we, in all of our interviews, we like to get the business and also the personal story. And we'd like to start off just hearing more about, what brought you to Japan. So tell us your Japan story.
Well, the short story is I think many of us have seen Shogun when they were young, and I was fascinated by Shogun and the story of Anjin-sama. And it really opened the doors to a different culture and a different language and very different ways of thinking. And I think that kind of sparked my interest. And then I used to ski race. And I used to ski race on the Canadian National Disabled Ski Team. And that was my first visit to Japan in 1991. And then, of course, you're a young man. You come to Japan. It was just after Blade Runner came out. So it was just this fascinating impression of, modernity and tradition coexisting. And, I arrived, spent time in Tokyo, went up to Akita, to Tazawako, and engaged in World Cup races up there. And again, it's just this contrast of big nature, snow, tradition. And then you come back to Tokyo and you see the bullet trains and the buildings and, the bazillions of people. And I mean, it just fell in love with it. And then in my undergraduate degree in my last year, I did a course on contemporary China, Chinese politics and economics, where we did a kind of a concentrated course for 3 months in my hometown, in my home university. And then we went to China for 3 months, and stopover was in Japan again. So this is back in the early 90s. And it really gave me a sense of, wow, the world it's going to become an Indo-Pacific world, a world based on, Japan, China, Korea, and Southeast Asian economies and politics and diplomacy. And I felt I needed to be part of that, which meant coming and studying here, learning the languages, getting a degree here, working here, and just becoming familiar with how things work culturally and politically and economically.
Wow. Well, it's funny. You see, there are a lot of China experts and there are also a lot of Japan experts, but there aren't a whole lot of both experts. And so what would you say, kind of obviously going back and forth between the two countries, how did you come to develop an appreciation for these two, major Asian superpowers, which are right next to each other, but very, very different?
Yeah, they're different, and they're both fascinating creatures in this region. Of course, Japan came out of a period of seclusion after the Edo period. It modernized quickly. It brought in lots of Western technologies, and then it moved in a very different direction, Imperial Japan. And, of course, that led to, the invasion of China and, the Asia-Pacific War. And this is fascinating. It ended very sadly with the atomic destruction of Nagasaki and Hiroshima and the Tokyo firebombs. But again, it managed to resurrect itself and recreate itself and become, by 1964, holding the Summer Olympics, right? I mean, this is an amazing story. It's really an amazing story. And China is very similar as well. I went there the first time in 92 or 93, and, there was no private ownership of vehicles. There was no buildings that were more than 3 or 4 stories high. People's body types were really different. People they were still giving coupons away for food. And today, China is a completely different place, right? We have bullet trains in China, Shanghai, Nanjing, Beijing, Guangzhou. All of these places have these mega first-tier cities that, if you dropped yourself in there, they don't look much different from Osaka or Tokyo or Seoul. I mean, these are great stories about how East Asian countries have developed and how they've transformed themselves into modern societies. And of course, they're very different modern societies, but they're fascinating histories that are interlocked and interwoven through war, through cooperation, through now rivalry. And I think it's a story of our lives, and it's a story I want to be part of.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's all I can say.
Yeah, wow.
And it's so funny, I have, for being in Japan for 14 years now, I know almost next to nothing about China. It's big and there's lots of money, and they went from not being able to own cars to everybody's got a Lamborghini.
Well, I think that story is much more complex and nuanced, and I often think of China as, 4 centuries coexisting. I mean, you can go back to parts of China in the countryside, and it feels very much like the 16th century, right? Poor, agricultural. And then you go to Beijing and Shanghai, and it's these ultra-modern cities, right? They're digitized because of the digital economy policies of the central government. So, It's a fascinating place, and Japan as well. If you get out of Tokyo, the country becomes a very different place, right? The speed of life, how people think, their values become, I think, even more conservative than they are broadly, and people think very differently. And this will probably segue into our discussion about the possible coming Prime Minister Suga. But, he comes from...
you said it.
Yeah, I did. But, he comes from a very conservative part of Japan, Akita. And that's where, he grew up. And that's where he built his fundamental values. And likely those values are going to come into how he governs.
Well, I guess I don't have to worry about those Aegis Ashore things anymore.
No, they're not coming anytime soon.
Nope.
Wow, no, Steven, it's great to hear your really broad perspective on, East Asia as a whole. I think a lot of, really successful academics and even business leaders here in Japan who are foreigners, as Parker mentioned, tend to be very Japan-centric. But it's really cool to hear you talk about all these other great cities. I was lucky enough to be introduced to, Hong Kong and Seoul just the past couple of years with my job. And, realizing how close we are to these completely different worlds is pretty eye-opening and incredible.
Yeah, and I think the longer you spend in the region, you realize how interlinked and intertwined all these places are. So I lived in Hong Kong for almost 5 years, working at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And, there's 30,000 Japanese migrants there. There's over 14,000
Wow.
Japanese businesses. So when you're thinking about Japan in the region, you need to think that Japan's economic footprint is everywhere. And they've been instrumental in helping build this region's prosperity through that, integration of Japan into the region. And this is why I think Japan is such an important country in the region, because it has interests, right? And, we can talk about the national security law in Hong Kong, but this is going to impact Japanese businesses in that city and how they think about the businesses in that city, and likely how they think about doing business in the mainland. So we can't separate the countries. And I think it's great to think about how they're all interlinked through migration, through economics, through, of course, history, through politics. And they keep coming back.
Well said. So you're an Asian public policy expert and also a professor of political science. How did you kind of get into that sphere?
Well, I did my PhD at Waseda University in international studies or international relations.
Mm-hmm.
And after my doing a postdoc there, I went to Hong Kong and I studied. I worked at the Chinese University of Hong Kong in the Department of Japanese Studies, and I taught about Japanese foreign policy and Japanese international relations. And teaching about Japan in a place like Hong Kong, what's fascinating is the images of Japan in Hong Kong and amongst Hong Kong people and amongst mainland Chinese people. And, there's a real continuum. There's those people that still think Japan is this militaristic country, and that, political leaders like Prime Minister Abe are marching Japan towards the remilitarization and possible colonization of East Asia. And then there's the others that, recognize Japan as a country that has demographic challenges, that has many political challenges, that's, hugely in debt, but also this soft cultural magnet, right? And you go to places like Hong Kong, and they know more about Japanese popular culture than myself. I think I learned about AKB48 there, and boys love there, and all these themes that, of course, I didn't know much about. And it really forced me to start thinking about these things. But in terms of international relations, again, going back to my initial experience coming to Japan and China, is that this is the future of this region. How this relationship works out is going to shape this region, not only in politics, but in economics, trade, how businesses work, how technology is going to either be integrated or bifurcated. I mean, these are real serious issues. And, international relations is something that, allows me to explore these issues and explore them at many different levels. And, it's fascinating. And I keep finding more things to study about in international relations that link these countries in this region.
It's definitely a very happening area right now, geopolitically speaking. I have to ask real quick, what city do you like more, Tokyo or Hong Kong?
That's a tough one, but I think absolutely Tokyo. And I'll say why. And my Hong Kong friend said, "What do you love about Hong Kong or Tokyo?" And I'll say, "I love to be able to walk outside under the blue skies endlessly." And that's something you just can't do in Hong Kong. Although Hong Kong is a great city, great friends there. It is a beacon of freedom and liberty and a very different kind of Chinese society. And it's now a bellwether for the direction of many aspects of Chinese, Greater China.
Yeah, it's, the past couple of years, some scary stuff is going on, but hopefully something good will happen.
The trajectory is less than positive, but I think that countries like Japan and my home country, Canada, they all have interest in what happens in Hong Kong and what happens in this region, because what happens in this region doesn't stay in this region.
It's not like Las Vegas.
No.
So obviously you chose political science and your focus is on geopolitics. But when you think about broader, Asian studies or China studies or Japan studies, there are people looking at pottery or people looking at history. What led you to go into the political science field?
Well, I think political science and international relations, there's a lot of overlap. And I think I find myself in between those two fields because what happens within the political context, that manifests in the international domain. So I don't think we can separate these two areas. But I think I was interested in, how there's a power change going on within this region as China reemerges as, I think, the central organizing principle within the region and how other countries deal with it. And I thought it was fascinating to watch how different countries are managing this process. And then within the context of Japan, of course, we have these push and pull relationship between conservatives and I guess what we call the liberals or the more left-leaning political parties and citizens in Japan. And I found this tension really incredibly interesting because I think the conservatives generally have it right, but of course there's aspects of the conservatives that if they tweaked some of their views, whether it's about history or whether it's about some of the continuing challenges between South Korea and Japan or China and Japan, if they tweak those views, I think that they could probably focus mostly on what's important. Economic relations, dealing with security challenges, and probably building better relations. But that's a problem. And then on the pacifist side or the left-leaning side in Japan, I think they're very wedded to the pacifist constitution, Article 9, and this creates challenges in terms of them actually becoming the leading party in Japan. So I found this interaction of how domestic politics is dysfunctional in many ways, affects international relations in the region, and creates dysfunction. And this is really, really interesting to watch as an outsider, because you see, right? You're Americans, I'm Canadian. History is something we get over with. We think about how Japan and the United States have dealt with their war, and we think about how, for example, Southeast Asian countries in Japan, they pretty much got over Japan's imperial period. But of course, Korea and China haven't. And that's partly their problem, and it's partly Japan's problem as well. So this intersection of domestic politics and international relations is absolutely fascinating, and I'm bewildered by it. I continue to learn from it. And I think now I'm in a position in my career that I can maybe push things in a different direction. I'm sorry to bring it down to like the elementary school level, but the first time I got to really start understanding Japan, and I thought, you go to Japan, you're in Asia, you're right next to China and Korea. And when you're in the United States, Asian culture is just kind of all lumped in together. It's like, there's a Chinese element here and a Japanese element there, and bam, it's all Asian. But when you come to Japan and you start to understand Japan and listen to Japanese people and get in these discussions, you realize these countries hate each other. And of course, not always, but especially in conservative circles, there is a lot of frenemies type stuff going on, between these three nations. And of course, there's the political level and even at the kind of the social level and the society level. Well, absolutely. And, I'm going to leave South Korea a little bit separate. But if you look at the political elites, both in China and Japan, their great-grandfathers knew each other. This is an amazing thing, right? Like Prime Minister Abe's great-grandfather, Kishino Nobutsuke, he was the governor of Manchuria, right? And he knew Mao, and he knew the first generation Communist Party leaders. And guess who's in power today? Prime Minister Abe, right? President Xi, his comes from what's called the red aristocrats. And, his father was part of that first generation of Communist Party members. And they were, in direct conflict with Prime Minister Abe's great-grandfather's family. I mean, it's amazing to think that this is a multi-generational political competition. And it's still with us today, and it kind of explains some of the challenges that exist between these two countries. Now, South Korea is a little bit different, right? But even South Korea, Park Geun-hye, her father was actually a Japanese speaker. He was in the Japanese Imperial Army, and he was the president of South Korea in post-Korean War period. And again, this goes to this fact that these three countries are tied together in so many different ways in terms of history, in terms of culture, in terms of their families, their political elite, and it's still with us today, and likely it's going to be with us far in the future.
Well, and it's almost, what is it, like a little bit more big or macro than a sibling rivalry, but what is it, when you have neighbors and you've got similarities and differences, sometimes you want to accentuate those differences to stand out.
Absolutely. But, if you share a table with a Korean and a Japanese and a Chinese in any of their countries, they're going to just enjoy the food. They'll talk about the similarities. This people-to-people relationships is fundamentally different than I think at the elite level with politicians and, of course, the geopolitical issues within the region. And the geopolitical issues in the region are serious.
Now, it's really funny. It's kind of reminds me of learning about diplomacy and hearing about these high-level diplomatic discussions. These guys will be like yelling at each other around the boardroom table, and then they'll go out for drinks and laugh about it.
Yeah, if diplomacy was that easy nowadays, I don't think it's happening, right? Not just because of COVID. I think that the political differences are very, very acute now, and they're deepening, and it's going to become increasingly difficult to have those hard conversations with between Japanese and South Koreans and Chinese going forward. And we need to create bridges to ensure that those dialogues go on.
Yes, it was earlier this year, I think, on an episode, we talked about the emergence of Zoom diplomacy and how it's not really very effective.
No, there's not a lot of Mao Tais being drank over Zoom or Korean soju or Japanese sake, right? And I think, the alcohol does create a loop, and it does help relax, and it personalizes things in a way that, Zoom can't, and, formal meetings can't. And, I think we still need to provide those kind of avenues where diplomats can get together informally to start to get to know each other at a more personal level and find opportunities to build dialogue and understanding.
The point on the political elite all being kind of connected, back into the past, that's something that a lot of people don't know.
Yeah, and it's actually to be expected. If we think about Japanese history, think about the Meiji Restoration, it was Japan that, developed first within the region, modernized first within the region. And as Ezra Vogel writes in his new book, Facing History, that, this is a really, Japan was the teacher, became the teacher for the Chinese in terms of how to modernize, how to resist foreign intervention. And this role as the teacher, and as Japan being the teacher, really, went as far as 1931 until Japan really occupied and created Manchuria. And we had 15 really bad years between the two states. And, following Japan's surrender to the United States, there was really little cultural exchange between the two countries. But, beginning with, after Mao Zedong passed away, and the reform and opening up in Deng Xiaoping, Japan again took on that teaching role of how to rebuild the economy and how to modernize. And still today, I think Japan has that role. But of course, China has modernized tremendously. So it's also going to have a position where it's going to teach Japan. And I think we've moved from Japan teaching in the early modernization period and up until the 2000s, 2010s, to now where I think they're going to start to teach each other. And that's going to be a really fundamentally different dynamic between the two relationships. And I think it's an opportunity to build stronger relationships at the people-to-people level, but also the business level, and hopefully at the government level.
You're now listening to Tokyo Wave.
Well, you just mentioned Ezra Vogel, and I have this in my notes that, in the international relations world, people with a background such as yourself are known as Japan hands. However, the study of Japanese politics has waned since the days of Ezra Vogel's Japan as number one. What does being a Japan hand mean to you, and what do you think lies in the future for those looking to go into the world of Japanese political science studies?
Well, I think that a Japan hand has to have a critical understanding of, let's say, Japanese political system and Japanese political trends. But I don't think the future Japan hand, and I would argue today's Japan hand, can solely just focus on Japan. I think that they need to focus on the region. I think they have to understand Japan's historical place within the region, historical relationships, as I mentioned, with the political elite in many countries. I think they have to understand how Japan has negotiated these critical and sometimes difficult relationships. So for me, a Japan hand needs to know the language. They need to have a solid understanding of the politics and culture and general trends. But I think they have to see Japan within the region and globally. And that's going to require a very different kind of training. You're going to have to know much more about the Chinese political system, the Korean political system, the U.S. political system, to see how Japan fits within that. Because Japan is one of those interesting countries. It's not just an Asian country. It's a country that has influenced how global institutions have evolved. Under Prime Minister Abe, it's been an instrumental defender of multilateralism, as evidenced in signing the Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement or the Japan-EU Infrastructure Connectivity Initiative, as well as leading the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. These are the new paradigms of international cooperation, and they've weaved somewhat isolationist Japan, inward-looking Japan, into the international fabric of the global community, not as a peripheral partner, but I think as a central partner. And with that, then I think, again, the Japan hand has to understand not just Japan domestically, but how it's part of this international fabric that's shaping global trends.
You mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or as I like to call it, the TPP.
Just please say TPP.
And after Trump came into office in 2017, that was dead in the water. It was deader than fried chicken, but it was really Prime Minister Abe under his leadership that came back into conversations, and they made it happen. Of course, the United States unfortunately did not join it, to honestly, I think, their detriment, but that Japan was able to lead that multilateral policy discussion really showed that, the Japan of 20 or 30 years ago, I don't think we would have seen that.
I think that comes out of Prime Minister Abe's understanding of, Japan's future, Japan's security, and he understands that if the economy is not growing, Japan can't really fundamentally change any of the equations within the region. If you look at the Japanese budget, I think 73 or 74% of the Japanese budget is fixed costs, social welfare, paying back the debt, and I can't remember the third category at this moment. I apologize, but 73%. So you only have about 27% of your budget to deal with hard security issues and all those other issues, right? So if that's the case, then, how can you increase that pie? And the only way you can increase that pie is by building and growing the economy, making the economy more productive, bringing in more people. So I think that Prime Minister Abe has very much, he understood that equation. And as a result, he focused on building economic policy. It was an imperfect policy under Abenomics. I think he should have called it economic acupuncture. But I mean that's quite seriously, because it was a bunch of little changes, not so much big changes. This has led to some more substantial changes. But he understood that if you want to deal with security issues, you want to deal with all the problems that Japan has, and you want to have a more globally oriented Japan, that you need more resources. And that means building the economy. And I think that was his approach, and that explains his commitment to the TPP and making those hard choices and compromises with stakeholders in Japan.
And that's one thing, the TPP never could have happened unless we had a prime minister with the clout of Prime Minister Abe, because the farm lobby here in Japan was just so adamantly against it.
Yeah, but I think it's it's a constellation, right? A constellation of stars coming together. Following the disastrous rule of the TPJ, I think that Japan realized it needed to move things forward. I think that the United States walking out or first coming to the table meant Japan wanted to be part of the deal. Without the United States, it was not meaningful. But then realizing that Japan's future and commitment to multilateralism required Japan to lead these kinds of agreements. I think that it was all of these things coming together, plus many other factors that led to Japan leading the TPP, and likely I think Japan and working with other countries like Canada, Australia, they're going to bring in other partners, whether it's Thailand, the UK, and it's going to become even a more significant trade agreement going forward. And again, it goes back to that point. Japan is going to be creating and leading, an international trade agreement that is going to be a significant one in shaping global trends.
Well, talking about the politics of Japan, I think we have to look forward, and we can't do that without talking about Prime Minister probably Suga. And, throughout Abe's, 8 years? Has it been 8 years?
Nearly 8 years.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to fathom because, watching Japanese politics up until then, prime ministers were like Skittles. Ooh, there's a green one. But obviously, we had a very steady leadership under Prime Minister Abe. And I think, as you so eloquently put, we had some great successes and also some kind of sort of okay situations with the economy. And you're absolutely right. It wasn't really 3 errors. It was 300 needles. And sometimes, he poked and they went, ooh, and sometimes he poked and there was nothing. And obviously, we think Suga is going to more or less continue those policies. But what do you think Suga has to do in order to recapture that zeitgeist? Or do you think he's bitten off more than he can chew from the get-go?
Well, I think looking at the current cabinet's chief cabinet secretary Suga, that I think it's important to look at his relationship with Prime Minister Abe. He's been at his side, pretty much 365 days a year for the past 8 years. Part of decisions, he's always tried to, I think, probably pull Prime Minister Abe away from perhaps more nationalist or more conservative agendas, such as revising the constitution. And I think that this speaks to Suga's centrist position, his, I guess, understanding of what will go through and will be supported by the ordinary Suzuki and Tanaka and what won't. And I think that really, to me, sends a strong signal that he understands, what I think ordinary, not elite Japanese want. And with that, I think that he's going to likely, I think we could characterize his potential prime ministership as sustainable, stable, a continuous kind of policy orientation that very much resembles and takes on most of the Abe agenda. But at the same time, I think he's going to try and distinguish himself. And to distinguish himself, he's going to call upon and think about his own background, growing up in Akita. What do rural Japanese people want? And, what is the needs of ordinary, Tanakas and Suzukis? And I think that's really, really critical. He's not a political blue blood like Prime Minister Abe. And that means that he has a different view about the direction of Japan, the needs of Japanese people. So, thinking about where he might go, what his cabinet will look like will send a very strong signal of how much continuity there will be at the domestic level and at the international level. And I suspect we're going to see much more continuity. And I suspect actually that we're going to see a role for Prime Minister Abe as a senior statesman, in particular dealing with U.S.-Japan relations. As in many ways, as we've seen Lee Kuan Yew and other prominent Asian senior statesmen have a strong role in I guess, being that lighthouse that keeps the country moving in generally the same direction. Where he might turn, I think that we've already seen some discussions about him wanting to increase the sales tax to deal with. Yeah, this is the last thing I want.
He said that before the election.
It was a bit. This is really interesting, and I think it represents one of the distinguishing features between Suga and Abe is that, I think Abe tried to reshape the social contract by giving job opportunities to young people, by changing the employment landscape. And, he had broad support of young people because I think he understood that Japan's future meant that the social contract needed to change to deal with the realities of a graying population. And, my worry is with potential Prime Minister Suga is that he's touched upon this idea of an increased sales tax to deal with the social welfare burden that's going to come with the graying population. And that could mean a return to a more conservative view of the social contract, thinking about Japan's elderly, which is important, of course, but not thinking about the future of young people. So I think that's a really, really interesting thing for us to be thinking about is what is the social contract of the government and Japanese people? How does this affect identity? And how does it affect the orientation of government policy? Because returning to the social contract that is focused on seniority-based pay, lifelong employment, this is not a positive choice for the future of Japan. There needs to be a new social contract that helps young people, have families and have sustainable incomes and regular income increases, so they can have family and children and have a prosperous life.
Yes, from what I've seen so far, it really does seem that Suga is looking to set up the stage as a pragmatist, as a realist, and really trying to address the issues that Japan is facing, possibly with less of the sugarcoating that we have become oh so accustomed to throughout the Abe administration. That said, I think, looking at the political horse trading that's going on and also looking at how this LDP presidential election is being played out right now, it almost seems like it's a perfunctory sort of a deal. And I almost feel, maybe you feel the same way, that the other two candidates are almost doing this not for this election, but with the next election in their sights. And obviously there will be another election next year. And a lot of people are already writing off Suga as a one-year pony. But I don't think Prime Minister apparent Suga sees himself as a one-year prime minister. So obviously there's no right answer to this question, but what do you think Suga is going to have to do in order to overcome that stopgap prime minister label? Can he get past that?
So I think potential Prime Minister Suga has a lot going for him. He's adept at negotiating the bureaucracy. He knows how to create personnel that will be loyal and function within the cabinet effectively. We've seen him rise from a rural background to really a key figure within the strongest and probably most consequential premiership in the post-World War II period. So I don't think we should underestimate this gentleman whatsoever. I think that he has the strong backing of Prime Minister Abe. And importantly, I think if we look at do a faction analysis of Japanese politics, that the most important factions within the LDP, the Aso faction and the Abe faction, are supporting him. And I think that they're supporting him because they want continuity in policy, continuity in Japan's trajectory at the domestic level and at the international level. And I think this, when we look at this at a broader level, I think this includes to continue to strengthen the relations with the United States and to create a safe distance with China. And I think the marginalization of the Nikkei faction is very much evident of that Japan is moving towards the United States, strengthening that relationship, and that the factions are very supportive of that policy approach. And if a potential Prime Minister Suga does continue in that direction, there's potentially no reason to have a change. And again, going back to my point about the cabinet, who's in the cabinet will say a lot about who's going to be potential competitors going forward. I see Motegi staying in as foreign minister. Kono Taro, I think, is an important player and seen to garner and accrue public support for his, outspoken kind of matter-of-fact views about the defense. But I think as we move forward, we have to look how much sustainability, how much stability is brought through a potential Prime Minister Suga. And if it's stable, and if there's continuity in a positive way, I think that the Japanese people will probably choose to re-elect him.
So, from a layman's perspective, I think as soon as the Abe news came out, a lot of people assumed Aso would be the next to take charge. But I'm curious, what is your guys' opinion on that? And could Aso have a chance at running again, maybe next year?
Well, it was funny, and I saw some political briefings from various consultants before it became apparent that Suga was the guy who was going to be next up for this. But at the same time, I thought, Aso's been prime minister, didn't go over very well. And I think, Taro Aso is a very smart cookie. And he's been I think he's really championed Taro Kono. And Taro Kono is sort of the star of the Aso faction right now. And so, right up until Taro Kono said that he was not going to run, I think a lot of people thought that he was going to be in that race and the Aso faction would be championing him to be the next Japanese prime minister. But it didn't happen like that. And so from what I saw, it seems like this was something that seemed to have come together pretty late in the process. And so I don't know if you have any opinions about that, Steven, but I was really surprised that the Aso faction really so quickly decided to back Suga instead of going with their horse in the race and Aso faction member Taro Kono. What do you think happened there?
Well, I don't know what happened behind doors, but my sense is that Kono Taro is thinking about his own political future and what is the appropriate timing for vying to be the next prime minister of Japan. And I think he looked at the unstable situation in Japan over the next year or 2 years, and that's, the coronavirus, President Trump potentially being reelected, the economic damage that has come over the past 6 months because of corona, that I think he has made the decision that the timing is not good at this particular stage for him to raise his hand for the premiership. And I think this is probably why he probably had a discussion amongst the Aso faction and he voiced that view. And then the next step for Aso is to think about who to support, because I think he's realistic about his age, about the energy that's required to be the prime minister, in particular after Prime Minister Abe, right? Prime Minister Abe made something like 281 overseas trips, right? I mean, just hyperactive. That I think Aso has decided that it's better to support a candidate that will have broadly the same strategic interests as the Aso faction. And I think that's where Suga came in. I think another aspect is that I think the political elite understood that if there was a race between Ishiba and Kishida and Suga, or between Ishida and Kishida, that Ishiba could likely beat Kishida, a likely prime minister as well. And I think that they made the political calculation that putting all the factional support behind Suga would prevent Ishiba from emerging as an effective and potential candidate as the LDP president and eventual prime minister.
It really surprised me, and just for the simple reason that, at least as of a few years ago, Aso and Suga on a personal level weren't that close. There was a bit of rivalry, at least at one point, and I'm not absolutely certain. I mean, obviously they work together pretty frequently, so maybe that has been smoothed over. I know a few years ago there was a lot of tension, and Akira Amari, who is reemerged from a political scandal that happened a few years ago as a major power broker within the LDP, and he was rumored to have been sort of the bridge between Aso and Suga. So I don't know, in typical LDP fashion, if they built a beautiful concrete bridge and now they're best friends, but I would kind of doubt it. But at the same time, I do think this is a calculated political move on the part of Aso as the head of his faction.
Absolutely.
And I really wonder what the future holds for the Aso faction in this new cabinet, because obviously there's that sort of tensioned personal relationship, but now obviously, Aso has put his honko of approval on the prime ministership of Suga. So I really wonder how that power dynamic is going to play out in the next administration.
Well, I don't think anybody knows at this particular stage, but I think what we'll do, we'll have to keep our eyes on it and watch carefully. But I think if we were to make an educated bet, I think that the faction is probably positioning itself to eventually put forward a strong candidate like Kono Taro as a potential prime minister candidate in a future election. And that's the likely outcome. And if that's the outcome that you're looking for, then you want to position yourself and play nice at this stage so that you can, get what you want down the way. And I think that's what's happening.
You're now listening to Tokyo Wave.
And so we've got really nitty gritty into the underbelly of Japanese politics, but kind of to go back more to the macro side, and just in general, obviously you are in a lot of discussions with, of course, both academics and policymakers across both Japan and China and other Asian nations. And just to connect it back for our listeners who aren't as wonky as we are, I guess, I wanted to ask, and just doing public policy work myself, I love the crazy anecdotes that I hear, the sort of things that you hear in dinner conversations, and you see what's on television and you think, these guys are the most boring old men I've ever seen in my entire life, but there's a lot of funny stories in there. But obviously, there's probably a lot of things that you'd rather not discuss. But do you have any interesting anecdotes, maybe with names removed, about some interactions that you've had in this field?
What I've seen, I guess, over the past, 8 or 9 years, is Japan that is willing to stand up, willing to be much more confident, and ministers and diplomats being able to voice a view to countries in a way that they haven't done before. And I remember one really, really interesting incident was, of course, with Kono Taro. And what was interesting is when he became the foreign minister and he visited China, and his equivalent in China, Wang Yi, said to him that, because Kono Taro is quite hawkish on China. And, Kono Taro's father, he wrote the Kono Statement, which was a very apologetic and I think important document in terms of apologizing for Japan's wartime past and its relationship with China. But the foreign minister in China said, you're nothing like your father, to Kono Taro. And Kono Taro calmly said back to him, he said, you know what? You're not the China my father knew.
Ooh,
and
burn.
I found that to be such a striking shift away from how normal diplomats and ministers speak when they especially when it comes to China, because they're very cautious about, having any sense of elitism or arrogance or hierarchy in that relationship. And I think, that really represents how I think Japan broadly feels about China, that it's not the country that Japan knew 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's moved in a trajectory that's not positive for the region and for the global community. And I think Japan is now willing to speak up against that. And, I think, I'm not sure if that's the anecdote that you want, but I think it's a great anecdote that reflects a shift in Japan's overall position on China.
Well, these nations change every day. And even the Japan that I came to 14 years ago is totally different than the Japan that we have today.
Absolutely.
It has changed so much. And it changes every year. And a lot of the changes, we don't even notice it just being here every day. But in those same 14 years, China's changed. If Japan has changed, this much, like a meter, China has changed galactic mile in terms of just everything. Security, economy, and, shifting its weight around in the region, this Belt and Road Initiative, that cool app where cute girls can show videos of themselves dancing that happens to be Chinese. What a different world we live in, even from, a decade ago.
Yeah, and I think, we've touched upon China and Japan, but I think we should also touch upon Korea, right? And let's think back 15 years ago, Japan and Korea had the joint World Cup, and there was the Hanyu's boom here in Japan. So it was about when you came here, right? Korea was incredibly popular amongst many Japanese people. They were studying Hangul and watching dramas and, doing short trips to Korea. And that's changed, right? The tone of the relationship has fundamentally changed. And, how much of that is responsible for Japan? Well, I'm not going to comment on that. And how much is that responsible from on the South Korean side? It's an interaction, obviously, right? So, again, we've seen these societies transform and become more competitive. We've seen more security challenges emerge. We've seen old political rivalries emerge and disappear, which is really, really fascinating. And that's something might want to touch upon. If you remember when Prime Minister Abe came into power, our Chinese friends were comparing him to Harry Potter characters as the evil. I'm not a Harry Potter fan, right? But Dumbledore, that's right.
No,
Voldemort, right?
Voldemort.
And
wrong Harry Potter character.
Yeah, those first four years were incredibly hard on Japan, right? And the Japanese Prime Minister, and the accusations were incredible. And today, there's no comments about the Japanese prime minister and about historical revisionism. These have all disappeared, which strongly suggests, this is a tool for diplomacy and strategy. Where in the South Korean side, I think that the criticism against Japan is pretty sustained and enduring, and it doesn't come and go. It actually continues to intensify. And that explained a lot about the difference in bilateral relationships between South Korea and Japan and China and Japan. And those are really interesting areas to explore.
Just thinking about some of our listeners who may be in the U.S., younger, still in college, and maybe considering coming out to one of the big East Asian markets and or countries to work and live in, I'm curious to know what your opinion would be. And I preface this question in saying that, I came to Japan about 10 years ago, and it was about 2010, 2011, and all of my classmates were Korean. And I knew absolutely nothing about Korea until I came to Japan, and come from, a music production background, composing background. And they were showing me lots of Korean music. And as we all know, Korean cinema, Korean art, and everything is just kind of taking over the world right now, with Parasite winning 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture last year. So, personally, I see a lot of growth potential in Korea. I wonder if they've already maxed out or not. But yeah, I'm just curious if you were giving advice to a young American or someone in the West that was thinking about coming out to one of these countries, which one would you recommend to specialize in now?
So I think that'll depend on what you want to study. So I think if you want to study AI, technology, Internet of Things, China might be a really, really amazing place to go to today. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about how China is transforming those areas, I recommend Li Kai-fu's book called AI Superpowers. Absolutely incredible. And, they're transforming it in terms of, the applications they're developing, but also the scope and scale of technology. In terms of politics, I think that Japan is a great place to come because, everything that's going to happen in this region is going to happen through Japan. Japan is the forward aircraft carrier of every single democratic state in the region. And what I mean by that, Japan knows the most about the region. They're the closest to the region. Now they're a leader on these mega multilateral trade partnerships and infrastructure partnerships. Whether it's the United States or Canada or other countries, it's going to go through Japan. So I think having a strong understanding of Japan and its position in the region can give you a heads up. Trade, that's really an interesting area because trade is now moving what we call in the Indo-Pacific area through the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So learning a lot more about Southeast Asia and its kind of central role in these trading agreements is going to be increasingly critical. I think, of course, going to China and learning Mandarin is going to be really, really critical because this is the most critical country in this region in terms of the direction of technology, the direction of cyber sovereignty, the direction of authoritarian rule. Is technology going to bifurcate Unfortunately, yes. So what does this mean for businesses? What does this mean for many things that we're going to do? So I think it really depends. And, it's important to also study things like Indonesia. Indonesia is going to have almost 400 or 500 million people in the next 10 years. This is not going to be an insignificant country. It's an energy superpower, huge number of people. If you look at its geographic scope, it's about as long as Russia. It doesn't look like that on the global map, but you put all those islands together, it's a huge, huge place, right? And of course, India. When the Indian economy does come online in a much more significant way, we're going to need many more experts that understand India and the complexities there. So I would suggest, and it goes back to Parker's question, what should a Japan hand be? And I think a Japan hand has to understand how Japan fits in the region, which means you have to understand the region. And if you want to come out to this region, you have your kind of core country, but you also have to understand how it fits within the region.
That is a really good point, and something that really kind of puts things into perspective for me personally as well. Of course, studying about politics and political science and economy in Japan, you learn so much about the rest of Asia. I'm from Tennessee. We didn't learn a whole lot about Asia in Tennessee. And I really think that situation in the West is really working to the detriment of economic progress and thought leadership, because obviously if the future is Asia, if you don't know about the future, then guess what? You're screwed.
Yeah, Parker, the future isn't Asia. The present is Asia. It really is. I mean, the biggest economies in the world are centered here. Number two and number three, and China's probably purchasing power per person is already number one. India will be a fourth largest economy, third largest economy in the next 10 years. The future is not Asia. Asia's already here, and North Americans and Europeans better figure that out pretty quick. Start picking up the skills so they can negotiate these very sophisticated and powerful economies and societies. Otherwise, you'll be just left behind.
All right, Americans, put down that bong and get on a plane to Asia. Of course, you're probably not allowed back yet. Do that PCR test first.
Would you, just because we have you here, I'm curious, would you say, and I've heard a lot of people comment on this, that Africa is going to be the final, continent and, major countries and cities there to finally industrialize, and if we're talking about the future globally?
That's such a great question. And we don't know. And if you watch television and you read papers and you read blogs and you're thinking about what the contemporary crisis that we're facing, COVID-19 pandemic, we have no information about what's happening in Africa. And I think that is quite illustrative of how much unfortunately, it's just not on the radar of most of us, right? In particular at the time of a pandemic. So how it emerges out of the pandemic, how it will be played by outside powers. We've seen China invest an incredible amount of money into developing the BRI into Africa and helping build economies in Africa so they can extract resources. Some of this has been positive. Some of this is creating problems. We see Japan as a huge investor in Africa as well. Will that benefit Africa in the long run? Will the competition allow them to, take the milk from both cows? That will be great for Africa. But at this stage, we just don't know, because we just don't have enough information on the ground about what's happening there. And in a sense, we need to have much better understanding of what's happening in the region. Are they building the human capital to support industrial bases? And is that sustainable? And at this stage, I think it's premature to say that Africa is going to be the next industrial center. Where I think that there's a lot more potential is Southeast Asia, and South Asia, and I'm thinking India. And we've seen a huge amount of investment by the Japanese in India. They've built what's called the Mumbai-Calcutta corridor, which is an infrastructure package to allow for logistics to transport from the two biggest cities in the country. Japan has also built a manufacturing corridor northeast of Delhi. And this is Japan investing ODA with thinking about the future of where the next manufacturing network is going to be. And India is a great place for Japan. Japan's well-liked, respected. There's no inconvenient political issues or historical issues.
Oh, so inconvenient.
That's right. And, that means it's a platform for Japan to expand its influence in that part of the world. So much before Africa, I think India and Southeast Asia are going to be rising stars in terms of investment and industrial centers.
That's really, really interesting and great to hear your comment on that. The reason I ask is because I always get so jealous when I hear stories about Western foreigners that came to Japan before the bubble era, established here, and then got to kind of ride the wave of the economic growth, right? So I'm always wondering, okay, what's the next country, right? What's going to be the next bubble era Japan?
Who's going to buy me that Lamborghini?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think Japan and China are somewhat unique. Mm-hmm. Korea doesn't have the size that Japan and China has.
Right.
And, there's no next China at this particular stage. There's no next China because there's no country that has the same kind of government that could marshal all the resources and, build special economic zones like the Chinese government did. And just no next China. Southeast Asia is a bunch of smaller countries that are not well integrated. And if they don't integrate better, then it functions as small countries that can't replace China. And India right now is, it's still a fractured economy and polity where states are much more powerful than the central government. So a lot needs to change for them to replace China, and it's not happening.
Well, I know this is a loaded question, but China, I guess we have to talk about China. And you can't talk about China without looking at the current geopolitical stress going on between China and basically the West. Because you have the issues with Hong Kong, you have the South China Sea, and it really does seem that China has adopted a foreign policy of F you to all of these issues that Western nations really see as bugbears. But at the same time, it's almost like, we're here, we're massive, got a problem, deal with it. Bada bing, bada boom. We're massive, we're rich. What are you going to do about it? Bomb us, try. Our army's bigger, And that really has come to a head, I feel, in recent years and even in recent months. But what's going to happen next? Because it seems like we're almost in a Cold War-esque sort of a situation, but obviously no one has their finger on the nuclear button unless we're just not being told about it. But, what do you think is going on?
So I think that we're just at the start of a very serious competition between the United States and China. And I think you articulated it quite well at the start, saying that it's a competition between China and the West. But I would maybe caveat that, because I think the West is a poor descriptor to describe all the countries that are feeling uncomfortable with China's reemergence. We have India feeling uncomfortable, many Southeast Asian countries feeling uncomfortable, Japan, South Korea behind doors. So, many countries are feeling uncomfortable with China's rise. And I think it's innate. It has to do with what's happening domestically in China. It has something to do with what China is doing regionally in terms of activities in the South China Sea. And I think it also has something to do with growing social economic inequalities and cultural representation in our home societies. And I think that is something really underreported. So let's think about what's happening in China itself. And as an outsider, we see things like, 1 million Uyghurs in re-education camps. And this is scary, right? It reminds us of what happened to the Jewish people in World War II. We see what's happened in Tibet. We've seen the national security law being adopted in Hong Kong and the arrest of teenagers and people that have basically said that they want a different version of the relationship between Hong Kong and the mainland. We see what's called technological authoritarianism, where the state is using technology to monitor all its citizens.
And anybody who uses TikTok.
Anybody that uses TikTok and probably Zoom, right? So they know all about me. But my point is that I think from an outsider's point of view, we're seeing these trends and we're going, my God, right? This is our neighbor. What happens if they spread this kind of behavior in our backyard? And I think there's some legitimate concerns about that. The regional areas, and I think you mentioned it, South China Sea and East China Sea, and what's happened on the Indian Plateau with, clubs and spears where Chinese soldiers are bashing up Indian.
They're beating the crap out of each other.
They're beating
literally,
the crap out of each other.
With their fists, right?
That's right.
Nuts.
Wow.
It's scary, right? This is very serious. And I think that for many states within the region, they see China as an assertive power that's changing the rules on the ground and on the seas to favor what their core interests are. And of course, this steps on the toes of many, whether it's Japan and the Senkaku Islands or, many of the Southeast Asian countries with the militarized islands. So I think this behavior is worrisome. But I mentioned that third aspect of, what's happening in our societies. And Japan is a little bit different because I don't think there's the social economic inequality and cultural issues that the United States and other countries face. But our countries haven't done a very good job at upskilling and keeping people employed and dealing with social, economic, and cultural marginalization in our societies. And, we have politicians like President Trump that are actively blaming the Chinese for all these problems. And you know what? The Chinese did build an amazing economy, and they did take some jobs from our countries. But in reality, those jobs turned into other jobs. And if you didn't upskill in your home countries, and if your governments didn't upskill in your home countries, you lost jobs. And we have intergenerational unemployment and cultural marginalization in the United States and many other countries. And, people are blaming China. So I think that we need to be, of course, I think China deserves criticism, but I think our own countries need to be much more self-reflective of how we haven't done a very good job in dealing with the social, economic, and cultural transitions in our societies. And now we have politicians blaming other countries for those divisions in our societies. So how do we get the game right between China and the United States and China and the rest of the world? We're going to have to fix the problems in our societies. We're going to have to push back against the really assertive behavior by the Chinese. And we're going to have to really think about how to deal with some of the egregious behavior that is happening domestically in China. And these are all difficult tasks. And I think it's not a one president that can fix these issues. It's going to be a successive generation of presidents and leaders that deal with these domestic, regional, and issues in China itself.
Yeah, we really should just go back to blaming Russia for everything. Those Russians.
It's such a short-sighted move to just blame all of these domestic issues on, countries that are just on the other side of the globe, right?
If you're a politician, though, it's really easy.
Yeah, it's easy, but it doesn't solve the problems, right?
Nope.
And what's interesting, if we look after the 2008 financial crisis in Germany, there was a lot of unemployment. What did the German government do? They started retraining people, the ones that lost their job. And it kind of, it stopped the social economic equality from increasing. It stopped that cultural marginalization that comes from, long-term unemployment, and people feel part of society. And where, in the United States and other countries, they haven't been very good about that. And you have whole cities that have disappeared. If you think about Detroit, or you think about, the southern states in the United States where industries have disappeared, they weren't replaced by anything. And of course, we have, generations of people that have been unemployed or underemployed. That's not China's fault. That's the particular government's fault that we're speaking about. So, those are some of the big challenges when you think about U.S.-China relations. But I think there is, of course, a real strategic competition between the two states, a real competition that's associated with very different kinds of governments. They're very different thinking about how they should rule their government. In China, I think the Communist Party is determined, and I think they're convinced that the only way to manage China is through a central government, a very strong central government managed by the Communist Party of China. And that is an unwavering commitment that I don't see any change in that worldview. And in the same way, the United States, who feel that democracy, freedom of press, rule of law is critical to what it means to be a democracy. These two worldviews are fundamentally in opposition to each other. And I'm not sure how the leaders in both countries are going to be able to ensure that they coexist. Because for
bare knuckle boxing
is not going to be very nice for us here in Japan or Korea.
Live
or
on TV.
right? Pay-per-view.
No, it's a very serious issue because I think they're incompatible political systems, and I don't know if they can coexist. But in the Chinese context, there's censorship and a great firewall for a reason. The outside world presents information and an understanding of the world that goes very much counter to the kind of society and identity and view of the world that the Communist Party has. And of course, for the United States and other democracies, well, we rely on freedom of press, and we can have these critical discussions openly of our governments. And this is how we strengthen our government. These are in fundamental opposition with each other, and they threaten each other. And I'm just not sure how they're going to move forward because at this stage, there's a dearth in leadership. And I think in one of your previous shows, you mentioned this article I wrote, Crisis in Leadership. And we do have a crisis in leadership in many countries, including the United States and Japan and China. And I hope not in Japan going forward.
Well, we'll have to see how that works out. Of course, we cannot tell the future, but we can only have our fingers crossed that this country that we all call home doesn't go to hell in a handbasket. On a different level, one thing in this discussion, I really thought about this whole idea of national identity. And of course, Aaron and I were both Americans living in Japan, and you are not American, you're Canadian. And I mean, for Japanese people, it's like, another white guy. What, do you teach English? Not really. But how do you feel that your identity as a Canadian has worked to your advantage or your disadvantage in coming into these political and social spheres in Asia?
So it depends on the period of time, all right? So I don't know if you remember when... I think it was for 2017 when the CPTPP was going to be signed in Da Nang, Vietnam. And the Canadian Prime Minister did a no-show. So
yes, I do remember that.
Yeah. So at that particular time, I think I wasn't in the good books of many Japanese policymakers.
He took a maple syrup break.
And there was a lot of, people asking questions about your background and what happened here. So I think that your national identity can be a boom or can be a problem. And at that particular time, it was a problem. Today, it's much better, and I think that's because Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Trudeau have done a lot to bring the relationship back together. And of course, they're on the same page of the book about the CTPPP and other issues. In the Chinese context, I think. There's a famous Canadian doctor that went on the Long March and was part of the initial formation of the current Communist Party of Japan in Yeian. And this Canadian doctor called Dr. Bethune. And many Chinese are taught about Dr. Bethune. It's in his Chinese textbooks. So when I went to China, everybody would ask me, where are you from? Why are you interested in China? And I'd say, well, I read about the history of Dr. Bethune coming to China, and it raised my interest in China, and that's why I've studied about China as well. And I think this endeared me to what's happened to many Chinese, because it showed me interest in China, but also how Canadians have contributed to a positive aspect of China. But of course, with the political arrest of Michael Korvig and Michael Spavor in December 2019, and the dwindling relations between two countries since then, Canadians are not so popular in the Chinese context now. So really the point of comparing these two stories is it's the political wins can make it easier for you to get into things, or it can make it much more complicated. And it's not just a Japan thing or a China thing. It happens across the region.
As a citizen of a particular nation, having these conversations, you kind of wear that flag on your sleeve, whether you want to or not. It's like, hey, I didn't make that decision. I was here. I was eating onigiri just like you.
Yeah, that's right. But I think, at the end of the day, when you're amongst a group of experts, and good experts, right? We're thinking about things with, using empirical data, and it's not so much what's your country background. It's, what's the data you're looking at? What's the things that you're using to make these observations or this analysis? And from that standpoint, I think there's a lot more synergy and convergence between, Canadian and Japanese than Canadian and other countries in the region. So I think that the nationality does come in place, and I think it's important. But when you're looking at these real serious geopolitical problems, ultimately you have countries that you're much more inclined to, right, than others, and you think along the same lines, and you have similar values and similar institutions. So it's just much easier to get along, right?
And we all just want to get along.
We sure do. We sure do. Yeah.
So I think we've solved world peace. I mean, the Nobel Committee, we are waiting for our nomination. Or maybe we should just ask that Norwegian guy, because apparently he'll give anybody a nomination. But on a more personal note, obviously you're here in Japan. You mentioned, you want to stay in Tokyo. And, what keeps you here? Like, do you have weird hobbies? Like, what makes you think, I'm just going to stay in this country and, be obviously a Pan-Asian expert, but based here in Tokyo?
Great question. So I think in terms of career, if you want to study Asia, Tokyo's the place, or Japan's the place. And it's the place because this is it's a democratic society. It's open. There's relative freedom of press. This is a dwindling treasure in this part of the world. And, and it's a needed treasure in this part of the world. If you want to be able to study the region, Tokyo provides the access, it provides the freedom, it provides the resources. And I think it's an essential partner for the United States and other countries to shape the Indo-Pacific region. So career-wise, it's the best place to be, and I do have a lot of opportunities here. Personally, I just love Tokyo. It's a great city, right? Great restaurants. It's safe. Seasons, except for those 6 weeks of humidity and stickiness, right?
Like right now.
Yeah.
And typhoon season, yay!
And it's the worst right now because we can't go out so much, right? Because of COVID-19. You can't go to the beer gardens and drink beer endlessly. But Tokyo is such a great city, and besides my work, I do kendo. I've done kendo for 20 years. It's a great way to be part of the local community. To be part of Japan, and to just turn your brain off. And there's something really special about shouting as loud as you can. You can't do this in normal life, right?
And beating each other with sticks.
You said that. I mean, it's really great. And
they're special sticks.
Kendo is great. I just love the Japanese countryside. There's so much to see, the history, the culture. Food. Japan is, the longer I'm here, I just think it's a really amazing country.
You mentioned that you spent some time in Akita when you first came to Japan.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite inaka?
Inaka. So, that's a great question. We spent the summer in Hakuba this summer. We left to escape COVID and spent some time in the countryside, and we absolutely loved it. From Hakuba, we went to Togoshi Jinja, and we had Togoshi Soba. We went up to Yamagata to see the Japanese mummies. That's the coolest thing you should see in Japan.
Whoa.
Mummies.
Japanese mummies.
Not the one you're thinking of. Japanese mummy, just like the Egyptian mummies. It's amazing. So if you do ever get a chance, there's a great temple up in Yamagata that has a real mummy there's this guy that's turned into leather, and they perch him in the shrine. Really amazing. But from Hakuba, we went down to Kanazawa and Toyama, Takayama. I mean, it's a great spot to see rural Japan. Try all the foods and see the Sea of Japan. I mean, it was great. I'd love to go back. I'm also a fan of Beppu, but I think that's the hot springs.
Yeah. You got to get on an airplane to go to Beppu unless you're really, 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 really good at driving long distances.
Yeah. What about you guys? Where's your favorite rural area?
So when I was in high school, I went to Iwate. And so I did a summer exchange program in Tono in Iwate Prefecture. And so that's kind of my
Furusato.
my inaka,
Yeah.
so to speak. And also, when a couple of years ago, we actually successfully made my hometown, which is Chattanooga in Tennessee in the United States, a sister city with Tono.
Oh, wow. Is that you spearheaded that?
Yeah, well, I don't know if spearheaded is the right word. It's more like acupuncture.
Just like Abenomics.
Yes. Lots of little needles.
What about Aaron?
Yeah, for me, honestly, probably so far Hokkaido and the many amazing, beautiful places and cities up there. I've really loved. And my girlfriend's family is all in the Toyama and Kanazawa area.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh my goodness. As you mentioned, the Sea of Japan, the food really tastes different. It's a whole different vibe over there. The Japanese too, the dialect in Toyama Prefecture that my girlfriend's whole cousins and they all speak is really interesting and lots of fun.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think if you fly into Tokyo, then it's probably the same of all over the region, right? You fly into Beijing, Nanjing, or Tokyo, Seoul, and if that's all you see, you don't really get the sense of what that country's about. It's really critical to go out to the countryside and spend some time there and talk to the locals and listen to however they're, the slur and try to see if they have the Japanese version of somebody from Tennessee. And it's
they might have that. I think I've seen it a few times.
But I mean, it really gives you a different sense of the country. And I really recommend anybody that does come to Japan to spend some time in the countryside, wherever it is, because it just, Tokyo, Osaka is great, but it's in many ways, it's not Japan.
I don't know why I have to ask this question now that it's in my head. I mean, we all know what an American redneck sounds like, but what does a Canadian redneck sound like?
Ooh.
That's true. There was a couple, I think this Doug and Bob McKenzie was this 1980s show. And these guys, if I remember it right, everything they said was, you know what I mean, Bob? Let's have another piece of bacon, Bob. Right, it's about all I can remember. The rednecks don't talk much.
They're mute.
Yeah, kind of mute. No, they don't talk much, and I think they don't like French Canadians. Everything they blame on Ottawa and Prime Minister Trudeau, the old one, and they're monolingual carnivores. Yeah. That's how I would describe a Canadian redneck. But they're charming. They're charming in their unique way.
Well, thank you so much for coming on Tokyo Wave today. It's been an enlightening discussion, and I feel like the wonk contingent of Tokyo Wave fans got a heavy helping of great content.
Thanks so much. It's great to talk with you both and share some views. And again, put Japan in a regional context. I just think that's so critical. Japan is, of course, amazing, but it's linked in so many ways, culturally, historically, politically, economically, and security, not just to the region, but the world. And I think that's how we should talk about Japan, and that's how we can make Japan relevant.
Thank you so much, Steven. I think our listeners and Parker and myself are...
Don't cry. Don't cry.
It was so educational. So good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Hope to be back.
Hey, listeners, that's right. You listener right there.
Who do you think should be our next guest on Tokyo Wave? Let us know. Drop us a line at wave@tokyowave.jp.
We hope you enjoyed Tokyo Wave.
If you haven't already, you can subscribe to our podcast on Pineapple, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. And also you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
Join us again next week on Tokyo Wave.